Okay. Well, I'll share my screen in a second, but I'll just say, as always, it's a real pleasure to be here with the City of St. Helens City Council.
So let me officially get this open though, Seth. First.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
I thought that was the hit it. Okay.
So I'd like to open this public hearing.
Great.
I'd like to open this public hearing. The time is 6:02 p.m. The topic is EPA community-wide assessment grant update, and I'm going to turn it over to John just to explain a little bit further why you're here today, Seth. So
yeah, thank you, Mayor. This is a project that the city was competitive a few years ago, securing funds for a community-wide assessment grant. It's a project that brings federal resources to the St. Helens community. Those resources are used to identify brownfield challenges on properties throughout the community. And we've been working on this for a couple of years now. And a lot of communities go into these grants with big aspirations. They never really get the money spent. And we're in a pretty unique place here where we've managed to spend all of the money in this grant. So it's the EPA is pretty satisfied with that. And it's really good thing we're not looking at turning back money that was unspent. So we have had Mal Foster Alonji working on this project, and they're going to be leading this closeout report with Seth Otto and Meredith DeAndre, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, councilors. As I said earlier, always a pleasure to be here chatting with you. I've had the pleasure of working with City of St. Helens and in various different capacities for going on almost 7 years now. Just realized the other day, going back to the acquisition of the veneer property and the area-wide planning grant component that we help facilitate for the redevelopment visioning of that property. The community-wide assessment grant was a follow-up to that. I think it's very illustrative of the city's really profound success in leveraging opportunities from one to the other. So taking advantage of the success that you had in obtaining funding for the planning work on the waterfront and turning it into a community-wide program. And so that's what we're going to sum up today, is the work that was completed through that community-wide assessment grant. So I'm going to share my screen. I should also add, I'm joined by my colleague, Meredith DeAndrea, who has been the lead on the technical aspect of performing the actual work through the grant. So the phase 1 and 2 environmental site assessments, the cleanup planning work that we've done. And I have to say, she's also done a phenomenal job of helping negotiate with DEQ in getting resolution on a number of these projects that were getting kind of sticky. And I have to say, I'm really proud to say that we are wrapping up this project at the end of the month, and we have a clean resolution with DEQ on all of these projects that we've worked on. So I think that's a great milestone, and Mary really deserves all the credit for that. So let's see. I have the presentation as a PDF, and I guess it's probably just easiest if I work off of that, since that's the same copy that everyone else has received who received notice here. So I'm going to share my screen, and there we go. Can you see my screen? Awesome, great. So I think we've done the introduction component of this. Overview of the presentation tonight. Just give you a little bit of background on what we did with the grant, the purpose of the grant, and what was completed. That will include a summary of the site inventory, some of the community engagement activities that we completed, and then I'll hand it over to Meredith to run us through the work that we did, really the bulk of the work that we completed through the grant, which was evaluating sites within the city that had questions around past uses that needed further investigation and resolution. And then we'll talk about next steps. We'll close it out with that. And of course, welcome any questions that you might have. So, you know, a lot of you are familiar with this, but just for everyone to make sure we're on the same page, what we're talking about when we're talking about a brownfield, as officially defined by the EPA, is a real property which is negatively impacted by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substances, pollutants, contaminants, controlled substances, petroleum, etc. There's a whole slew of different elements that could negatively impact a property. But the point is that the presence or potential presence of impacts from these substances on the property impacts their use, their transaction to another party, their reuse for a new in a new development, are all impacted or impeded or prohibited by the known presence or potential presence. And the potential presence is just as important, because stigma can be just as damaging for a property transaction if it's believed to be that the property is negatively impacted by some form of environmental contamination. So the community-wide assessment grant provides funds to communities to look at sites that might have some form of environmental contamination, and to help the community bring resources in to evaluate those, to prove them, and to look for ways to address them and clean them up. So specifically, this community-wide assessment grant, the scope of work and the work agreement that the city developed with the EPA allowed funding for an inventory of sites around the community, engagement with community members to provide education around brownfields and around potential threats that they pose, but also the opportunities for cleanup and redevelopment. The environmental investigations, which again is really the bulk of the work that was completed through the grant. Some cleanup planning, which means, okay, you've identified problems, then what are you going to do to address them? So the intent here is not just to find problems, but to actually come with solutions and to help property owners work toward resolution with DEQ if that's needed. And then there's a small amount of money set aside for area-wide planning, which really, in the end, there really wasn't much of that through this grant, and that's really because we had some great candidates for the environmental site assessment. And so the work was really focused on assessing, characterizing the environmental conditions on these properties and working with them to get, again, resolution with DEQ. So the project was kicked off in 2018, and at that time, the city defined a project purpose and an objective to guide decision-making and implementation of the grant, and that was stated as the primary objective of the St. Helens Brownfield Assessment Program is to identify and assess priority sites in the target area to remove the barriers to redevelopment created by their brownfield status. So really, reading between the lines there, what that means is the city's bringing these resources to bear in the target area, which is contiguous with the urban renewal area. We'll see that in a minute, with the intent of helping to foster community and economic development. And so that's the core here, really, of the community-wide assessment program, is understanding that these impacted properties are not achieving their maximum potential. They may even be a burden on the community, but by bringing resources to help clarify issues and help remove stigma, you create opportunities for reuse and economic development, and help to achieve community visions for planning within this target area. There's an overall work plan that we put together back in 2018 when we kicked the project off, and you can see the primary components of our scope of work. As the contractor completing the work on the grant, project management throughout the life of the grant, which consisted of regular updates in coordination with the city, but we also provided quarterly, or the drafts of quarterly update reports, which Jenny compiled and filled out or finished and coordinated with the EPA project manager. We helped with public involvement tasks, creating a fact sheet, helping with website and social media updates, addressing requests from the local media, responding to media requests, generally related to public meetings. We helped the city facilitate a brownfield advisory committee and convened that committee 3 times. And the committee met at key moments throughout the project to provide insight and direction around how to perform the site inventory, the sites that we wanted to prioritize for outreach and investigation, and then reviewing and updating project status kind of toward the tail end of completing a lot of our site investigations. The open house events, it was determined that a standalone open house event to talk about brownfields and to bring this grant to the community was not the best use of the funds. And so what we did on 2 occasions was to take advantage of a standing city council meeting and come in with updates on the project to present the opportunity to the community and make sure that we had the best megaphone to broadcast this information out through the channels that already exist based on standing meetings and reporting out from council agendas. So that's how we really got the information out to the community, primarily through these meetings, through members of the advisory committee and social media. Then site inventory and characterization. I'll talk about the inventory in a few minutes. And then we had the phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. And then toward the tail end of the project here, as we were working on more complicated projects with more environmental encumbrances, we worked into the task of cleanup planning and helped to prepare responses to DEQ, documents that help them understand mitigation and media management on these properties to protect occupants, to protect future users of the site. And that was the purpose of that task force, to make sure that we had protocols in place that DEQ was happy with to address sources of contamination that we identified on a couple of properties. So this is the target area that we looked at. Again, it's the urban renewal area. So the grant came in right around the same time that the city established its urban renewal area. And so the intent here was to line up this resource with the city's focus on prioritizing redevelopment in that area and generating tax increment financing. And so we looked at properties, again, along the waterfront, Columbia Boulevard, and along Highway 30. So the primary commercial and industrial corridors of the city. We really steered clear a lot of the residential neighborhoods, which aligns obviously with your urban renewal area. So we completed a full inventory. This was a GIS-based Geographic Information Systems database in which we brought in data available from the city and the county. We also used data sets from DEQ and historic resources that we had available to us. And we identified sites that would eventually become priorities for outreach and engagement and eventual site characterization. So this was in 2019, there were identified 43 sites that were known to have some measure of an environmental impact through their presence on one of the DEQ databases. So that's the cleanup inventory or the leaking underground storage tank. And I don't have the breakdown here, but typically the leaking underground storage tank program has a higher number of sites. So these are old heating oil tanks that have maybe been out of use for several decades, but are still there and have corroded and are leaking petroleum or diesel product into the soil and groundwater, and they present a threat, and they're a real issue. And So there are a number of those, and we prioritized identifying them and looking at opportunities to engage with those property owners. Then we had what we called suspect, and these are properties that met certain criteria, basically related to their lower than market value, sort of what we call an underutilization ratio, where you look at the value of the land and the value of the property, and if the land is worth more than the improvements on the property, then you have a situation where it's considered underutilized and prime for redevelopment. And it potentially indicates the presence of some environmental contamination that's preventing it from being redeveloped or reused at a better capacity. Sites that we identified as unknown, we just didn't have enough information about. I should say these suspect sites, in addition to being underutilized through a basic calculation of value and improvement value, we also looked at historical use and zoning, and then completed a windshield survey where 2 environmental professionals drove through the target area with iPads and took notes of the sites that we flagged up as potential suspect brownfields, and then narrowed it down to those 114 sites. We had 181 properties that we didn't have enough information about. 155 we're calling central residential, and again, this relates to the zoning in the central part of St. Helens, the southeast of Highway 30, where, especially along Columbia Boulevard, there's a number of residential buildings that are actually in commercial use. So even though the focus was not on residential uses, because they're zoned residential and they're in commercial use, they were of concern. And so we flagged those up as well. And then there are 393 sites that we classified as non-suspect, but remained under consideration based on their zoning and historical use and status. So we wound up with a total inventory of 886 properties, and really focused in though on those 114 that seemed like prime candidates. And we worked with the Brownfield Advisory Committee to develop a set of criteria around outreach, engagement with property owners, and prioritizing opportunity sites for participation in the program. The advisory committee was made up of representatives from the city planning and public works departments, Columbia County, Board of Columbia County, Columbia Health Services, the Columbia County Economic Team, and we had 1 citizen at large. And as I mentioned, we met once to give them an overview of the program and their charge, and kind of empower them to take this out to their stakeholders. And then we had a follow-up meeting where we had the inventory. We talked through their priorities, made sure they aligned with the opportunities of the sites that we had identified as potential brownfields, and we got great direction from them. And again, they took that back to their stakeholders. And I know that we got at least one, I believe that we got at least one of the sites that we did an assessment on through Columbia County and through their participation in the advisory committee. And I know that we also lined up with another property owner through one of the open house meetings that we held as part of a city council meeting. So those were beneficial. They did lead to partnerships with local stakeholders and getting those grant funds out into the community. Just take a minute here. I'm assuming we'll take questions at the end. Is that your preference typically? Yeah. So I mentioned the evaluation criteria and how this guided our work in outreach to property owners and engagement. Again, these were high profile properties in commercial corridors. Certainly those that pose a threat to public health due to contamination. Thankfully, we didn't encounter anything that had an active release, although one of the properties we worked on did actually have some issues that we'll hear about related to vapor and gas. But again, we worked through those and identified pathways to ensure that they're not impacting occupants of the site. Prioritizing sites that have a potential for public access or transportation improvements, so align with long-range capital improvement plans and land use plans within the city. Willingness of the property owner. This is a voluntary program. We have certainly no order or authority to impose on any property owner that they participate, and so their willingness was a key criteria, obviously. And then for the city standpoint, there was a need to ensure that there was a return on this public investment. So these are high-profile properties that help advance community and economic development goals, either through addressing blight, through providing public access, through allowing reuse and beneficial outcomes for the city in terms of leasing or transaction value, tax generation. So those were the guiding principles that we used in terms of determining which properties were priorities. And in the end, we were able to complete 4 site assessments, each of them complex in their own manner, but also definitely meeting the criteria in multiple different fashions, and advancing the city's interest in improving the health and economic viability of the community. And we'll get back to some of that as we talk through these sites. But just given the time, I want to hand it over to Meredith so that she has a chance to share with you what we did and the outcomes on each of these, and then we can get to some discussion. So, Mary, I'll just keep driving the presentation. If you want to just give me a cue when it's time to advance, we can do that, and I'll go to the first site.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you, Seth. I'll just say real quick, as Seth said, I've been the environmental lead on this project and had the opportunity to work with the city since the get-go. And so I'm just really excited to get an opportunity to present to you guys on all the work that was done and all that the city was able to accomplish through these environmental site assessments. So I just wanted to lead off with that. But yes, so the first property is the 50 Plaza. This one is a commercial property. You probably are aware it's located right across from city offices, also adjacent to some other city-owned property. This was a site where the property owner found a heating oil tank. The heating oil tank was decommissioned in spring of 2019. And the contractor that did the decommissioning did some soil assessment, groundwater assessment, and actually did find some impacts, some diesel oil impacts. So this was a great opportunity for the city to come in and help. The property owner had these impacts. How do I get to closure? What do I do now? The city came in. We were able to do, Seth, you can advance maybe to the next one. We were able to do an additional site assessment beyond what the contractor did originally and step out from the property and into the adjacent properties, do a soil and groundwater assessment. We found, we were able to bound the impacts. We got to a point where we found non-detects and able to show that the impacts that were there were not posing a risk. We put together all the closure forms and documentation, submitted a report to DEQ. This one is real time, the most current, the most recent. And I can say that I got an email from DEQ just a few days ago. They were able to expedite their review, and they are approving closure for this site. So we are anticipating a formal closure letter for this one very soon. So this property, and assessment is just a perfect example of how you can utilize these funds, help out a local property owner, really get them beyond that roadblock of what do I do now that I found something, and get to a point where they can get to closure with DEQ. You can.
Yeah, I was just going to say that actually, that's so new that when I prepared this slide deck, it's actually changed. We're no longer in the process.
Right. It was literally a few days ago that I got that email from DEQ. So another property that we worked on, the Semling property. This one's located corner of 6th and Columbia. This is owned by the Semling brothers. You know, been in the family for years. Was previously used as a self-serve car wash, although that's been decommissioned for a while. And then through a phase 1 that was done, there was a interested party in purchasing the property. A phase 1 was completed. They identified a former fueling station on site, as well as actually one next door. And that potential for contamination, the fact that these former fueling operations were conducted there, stalled the sale of the property. So this was another opportunity for the city to come in, use some of these grant funds to try and answer some of these unknowns. Is there really contamination at the property? You know, where is it? Try to find some bounds, and that's exactly what we did. We went in and did a couple rounds of soil and groundwater investigation. We did find some impacts. Interestingly enough, it was from the neighboring fueling station, but we were able to confine it to a particular area, a corner of the property. We also did some soil vapor assessment. There were some gasoline impacts, so there was a potential risk for vapor intrusion if a future building was built there. So we did the vapor sampling, and that was, we were able to show that there wasn't a potential risk for vapor intrusion. And answering these questions, getting this data allowed for the property transaction to occur. Now that the impacts were known, the prospective purchaser knew what they were getting themselves into and what they were dealing with, really push that forward. So again, a real success story with the use of the grant funds. Another property we worked on, this was a collaboration with the county. This is a site that's located right across from the Columbia County Jail. There were some concerns with this site just based on historic use. It was used for vehicle storage, equipment storage, maintenance activities. It also, I lost the presentation. There it is. There were also some neighboring sites that had similar, wrecking yard uses, potential for maybe underground storage tanks. So we performed a phase 1, did all the historical research, and through that, we did not find any underground storage tanks. No recognized environmental conditions were identified as part of that effort. We did suggest that perhaps some surface soil sampling be conducted based on those historic storage and use if and when redevelopment occurs. But through the grant funds, through the process, able to get it really primed and ready for if and when it's transacted or redeveloped. So again, a great use of the funds. A big property I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the former Boise White Paper site, and specifically the South 80 landfill that's present on that property. This is a site where there had been some historical monitoring associated with the landfill, but really a lot of unknowns. And we were able to go in and do a really thorough assessment of this area. We did soil, groundwater borings, along with landfill gas assessment throughout the entire footprint of the landfill. We also did multiple rounds and a really thorough investigation of indoor air quality within the buildings that were located in this area. You can probably go to the next slide. And we did find some stuff. There is methane being generated from this landfill. We found some impacts in soil, but the soil impacts are mitigated. There's a clean soil cap. We also, we didn't find any issues in groundwater. The soil vapor assessment, again, that was conducted over multiple seasons, multiple rounds, we were able to show that there's no risk to the indoor air for the buildings and the current operations and occupation, or current occupants and operations. We also were able to do a geotechnical evaluation. Anytime you're thinking about redevelopment on a landfill, that is certainly a consideration. And we got a lot of information out of that as to what would need to be considered from a stability standpoint for redevelopment. The real positives with this were that we showed there's no risk. Currently, it's all being mitigated, and there's a much better understanding of any future considerations that would need to be looked at, again, if and when redevelopment occurs. This one, we did, as Seth said, get to a point of closure with DEQ from the cleanup program, which is a great way to end it for this one.
And on top of that, also, it almost inadvertently reopened some conversations with DEQ's solid waste program, and we were able to sort of refocus their attention back on the things that really mattered here with this site, reminding them that the landfill was closed, that it remains managed and monitored effectively, and that the gas is not posing a current threat. I think that was an important outcome from the analysis that we did, providing multiple departments within DEQ the comfort that they needed, that they could close this out and assume that careful reuse is appropriate.
Yeah, so, in aggregate with all these properties, we were able to get to some form of conclusion. We got to, formal closure with DEQ. We got to a point where they were able to be transactable. We got to a point where we've answered a significant number of unknowns and questions that would inform redevelopment on all the properties.
Okay, so last component here of the presentation, keep it brief. The EPA has their annual grant cycle open again for their soliciting applications from communities to submit grant applications. And there are multiple opportunities for the city should you determine that you want to continue with your brownfield program and continue working on assessing properties that have been identified, working with the advisory committee. And so the ARC, as EPA calls it, is assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup grants. And so the assessment grant is the one that you have currently. That can be refunded through an application. The cleanup grant funds what it sounds like, cleanup on a specific site. And the revolving loan fund is a little bit more complicated. That's for typically for states and very large municipalities that want to establish a fund that they would loan to. In this case, it could be to private parties for brownfield assessment and redevelopment. I don't want to assume too much, but it seems like that probably is not a good fit for St. Helens. It's a fairly cumbersome program to undertake. At this point, I'm not aware of a site that fits the cleanup bill, but certainly there are sites that can be identified through the assessment grant that could then be taken to cleanup. And that's what many communities around the country do, is sort of follow the cycle of grants and recapitalize their assessment program and occasionally apply for cleanup grants as appropriate. EPA also has a brand new grant program. This is only the second year they're rolling it out. It's called the Multi-Purpose Grant. It really combines the assessment and cleanup grants into one, allowing the community to have more of a seamless process if they have some great opportunities in front of them. So it funds the full range of activities that the assessment grant would do, but also cleanup. So it would pay for remedial activities on an eligible brownfield property within the target area. And it's a larger grant, it's up to $800,000, and it covers a wide variety of activities. So just wanted to flag that up, that the grant application period is open. It closes at the end of October. It's something to consider. And you know, again, an opportunity for the city to continue to leverage the success you've had on identifying funding opportunities and obtaining them and implementing the program to great success. So that concludes the kind of formal presentation component here. You've got my contact information, Meredith's there. I think most of you have, in some form or another, had contact with us in the past, so certainly feel free to get in touch with us. And I think at this point, I'll probably, I'll see if I can stop sharing this, and we'll open it up for questions and comments and discussion.
Any questions, Matt? Anybody got their hands raised, anything like that? Well, the city council, I think, is pretty familiar with all these properties. You guys have done a very good job of keeping us informed on what's going on along the way. So,
I'd just like to thank Seth for a fine presentation and a very thorough explanation of brownfields and what this grant entailed. Thank you for the very thorough explanation. Very much appreciated.
Councilor Topaz, if you just unmute yourself, you can talk.
Buttons and okay.
There you go.
Did that before. There are two properties here. One's in and the other's just out of your field. The one industry that was here in 1920 is used to be the livery stable, and the groundwater, and this is on the corner of 3rd and St. Helens Street. Groundwater is contaminated with horse droppings, about 50 years worth. Is that something that you handle, or is that just considered natural?
Oh, it's not a. It's a challenging issue because in certain concentrations, animal byproducts can contain hazardous materials in them. But generally speaking, no, it's not a regulated substance in the sense of something like petroleum or PCBs or things that you typically find on a brownfield. I don't know, Mary, is that something you've encountered before?
There certainly have been situations where we have been monitoring for E. coli and other things. I think when it really becomes an issue is if it's a potable aquifer. Are people, installing wells? Are they drinking the water? It's also, can be something that we look at from water and discharge, to a surface water body. But as you said, like typically, assuming that those contact pathways are not an issue, it's not something that we look for.
Strangely enough, again, 1920 area is very close to one of the springs that supplied the drinking water just prior to plumbing. The other area is what used to be called Dillard Lake, which is just, it's on Old Portland Road about 5th to 6th Street. It's just outside your test area, but the drainage, if you take a look at some of the properties on 4th and St. Helens Street, the drainage is keeping their grass green. And that was at one time a site where stuff was dumped in from the mill. Is that under your control?
Yeah, I mean, the target area is just that. It's where we've targeted our outreach and focus on properties that, you know, again, because it's within the urban renewal area, it helps accomplish multiple objectives for the city, but there's no restriction on looking at properties outside of that.
Because it's also considered a kind of a wetlands. That's why I'm wondering.
I'm trying to think of where this is.
You know where the curve on Old Portland Road is, and it drops off. If you're coming into town, it drops off on your left side of the road.
Oh, sure. Okay, and then you come through an area of basalt.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That at one time got to be a dump for the mill. I mean, again, that's 1920-ish area, but especially in this very dry couple of months, you can see the drainage coming downhill. And at one time, there was a bridge on 5th Street to a single home.
And that area is now populated by residential
Correct.
development, right? Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Is that something, are you familiar with this because it's something that's been brought up in the past as a concern, an issue? Has it been studied?
Well, I know there's fecal coliform in the groundwater around here. That's, the city tested for that, and I can look at it. Again, one of the things that happened here was the original sewer system was a gravity flow to the river, and when they put the sewer plant in, they put a 30-inch concrete line and a pump station. So the ground has been really ripped up, and the transmission path of any water will go to a number of neighborhoods, and that would be the real concern, that what's draining out of the fill of Old Dillard Lake could be going a number of places along the old 30-inch line.
Okay. Well, you know, certainly sounds like the kind of thing that can be investigated through a program like this. Yeah, absolutely.
One of the other things that you're talking about, groundwater, between 3rd and 4th Street at one time was a logging pond for the flume coming down. So it's a basalt on either side with a pit basically in the middle, which is a bowl. And so stuff doesn't go away. And while it's all residential, the question is, what's its long term? And as I say, the livery stable is a beautiful picture. Used to be down in the council room of a group of people with horses and a wagon and a big livery stable. And the house that's on 3rd and St. Helens Street in the background. But it's all basalt, so you're talking about a bowl that doesn't drain, but it is all now residential.
Okay. They said that it's something definitely that a program like this would look into. So,
Yeah, thank you.
yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, if I could, I'd like to thank Seth and Meredith and all the MFA team, the work that they've done on it, but I'd be remiss in not recognizing Jenny Dimshow's effort with this. She's been a rock star with all of this. She's been a lot of coordination with EPA and consultants, and there's a tremendous amount of communication to make this happen and get this completed. So,
Thank you, Jenny. I know she's
John?
watching. I know she's here.
Yeah, it
John?
feels great to wrap it up. It's been 3 years, so.
John, have you thought of getting Jenny an assistant, because her ability to get things done, she's getting more and more thrown at her.
Want to be your assistant?
Yeah, that'd be a hard job. That'd be a very hard job.
No, we've kind of tracked this with the 3 years with Jenny has done a tremendous amount of work around this, identifying properties, public hearings. The one on 50 Plaza was unbeknownst to us, and it was, man, it was crucial to the buyer that bought that, not knowing that. And it was nice to have this program in place and able to help anybody who brought these properties to our attention in the time frame needed. So it's a good program.
So are we going to have a program like this for the Boise Mill site?
That could certainly be in the next phase. Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that's where you are right now. Is it worth pursuing this for the next round? There's a lot to unpack on the mill site for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, a lot of work could be done. It could be a good candidate for a multi-purpose grant.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so but this is the wrap up of this particular grant is why we have this here today. Yep. Okay, well, anybody other questions for Seth? I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I want to thank Meredith and Seth for this presentation and all the work they've done on this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
Yep.
Thank
It's
you.
our pleasure.
With that, we'll close this hearing and council will recess till 7 o'clock. Okay, this public hearing is closed.